Old French was the Gallo-Romance dialect continuum spoken from the 9th century to the 14th century. In the 14th century, these dialects came to be collectively known as the langues d'Oil, contrasting with the langues d'Oc or Occitan languages in the south of France. The mid-14th century is taken as the transitional period to Middle French, the language of the French Renaissance, specifically based on the dialect of the Ile-de-France region. The territory where Old French was spoken natively roughly extended to the historical Kingdom of France and its vassals, and Burgundy, Lorraine and Savoy to the east, but the influence of Old French was much wider, as it was carried to England, Sicily and the Crusader states as the language of a feudal elite and of commerce. Areal and dialectal divisions. The Norman dialect was also spread to England and Ireland, and during the Crusades, Old French was also spoken in the Kingdom of Sicily, and in the Principality of Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Levant. As part of the emerging Gallo-Romance dialect continuum, the langues d'Oil were contrasted with the langue d'Oc group to the southeast. The Franco-Provençal group developed in Upper Burgundy. Sharing features with both French and Provençal, it may have begun to diverge from the langues d'Oil as early as the 9th century, and is attested as distinct variant of French from the 12th century. Dialects or variants of Old French included the Burgundian of Burgundy, then an independent duchy whose capital was at Dijon, the Picard language of Picardy, whose principal cities were Calais and Lille. It was said that the Picard language began at the east door of Notre-Dame de Paris, so far-reaching was its influence. Old Norman, spoken in Normandy, whose principal cities were Caen and Rouen. The Norman conquest of England brought many Norman-speaking aristocrats into the British Isles. Most of the older Norman words in the English language reflect the influence of this variety of oil language, which became a conduit for the introduction into the Anglo-Norman realm, as did Anglo-Norman control of Anjou and Gascony and other continental possessions. The Anglo-Norman language reflected a shared culture on both sides of the English Channel. Ultimately, this language declined and fell, becoming Law French, a jargon spoken by lawyers, which was used in English law until the reign of Charles II. Norman, however, still survives in Normandy and the Channel Islands as a regional language. The Walloon language, centered around Namur in present-day Wallonia. The Gallo language of Brittany, the Romance language of the Duchy of Brittany. The Lorraine, the Romance language of the Duchy of Lorraine. Modern languages derived from Old French dialects other than the classical French based on the Ile-de-France dialect include Angevin, Berrichon, Bourguignon, Morvandirau, Champenois, Franc-Comtois, Gallio, Lorraine, Norman, Picard, Poitevin, Saint-Onges, Walloon. History. Evolution from Vulgar Latin. Beginning with Plautus's time, Classical Latin's phonological structure changed, eventually yielding Vulgar Latin, the common spoken language of the Western Roman Empire. This latter form differed strongly from its classical counterpart in phonology. It was the ancestor of the Romance languages, including Old French. Non-Latin influences. Some Gaulish words influence Vulgar Latin and, through this, other Romance languages. For example, Classical Latin equus was uniformly replaced in Vulgar Latin by caballus, nag, workhorse derived from Gaulish caballos, giving modern French cheval, Occitan cavall, Catalan cavall, Spanish caballo, Portuguese cavalo, Italian cavallio, Romanian cal, and, by extension, English cavalry. An estimated 200 words of Gaulish etymology survive in modern French, for example chêne, oak tree, charu, plough. Despite attempts to explain some phonetic changes being caused by a Gaulish substrate, only one of them is certain. because this fact is clearly attested in the Gaulish language epigraphy, e.g., on the pottery found at La Graufe, the Greek word peroxides appears as paroxide I. The consonant clusters, ps, and pt, shifted to xs, and xt, e.g., Latin capse greater than asterisk caxa greater than kes or captivus greater than asterisk caxtivus greater than of jatif. This phonetic evolution is parallel to the shift of the Latin cluster, kt, in Old French. The pronunciation, vocabulary, and syntax of the Vulgar Latin spoken in Roman Gaul in late antiquity was modified by the Old Frankish language spoken by the Franks who settled in Gaul from the 5th century and conquered the entire Old French-speaking area by the 530s. The name Francais itself is derived from the name the Franks. The Old Frankish language had a definitive influence on the birth of Old French, which partly explains why the earliest attested Old French documents are older than the earliest attestations in other Romance languages. It is the result of an earlier gap created between Latin and the new language, which severed the intercomprehensibility between the two. The Old Low Franconian influence is also believed to be responsible for the differences between the langue d'oil and the langue d'oc, being that various parts of northern France remained bilingual between Latin and Germanic for some time, and these areas correspond precisely to where the first documents in Old French were written. This Germanic language shaped the popular Latin spoken here and gave it a very distinctive identity compared to the other future Romance languages. The very first noticeable influence is the substitution of the Latin melodic accent by a Germanic stress, and its result was diphthongization, differentiation between long and short vowels, the fall of the unaccentuated syllable and of the final vowels, e.g., Latin decimus, a tenth, greater than of decimi greater than f dime, tithe, vl dignitate greater than of dmta, or vl catena greater than of chain. Additionally, two phonemes that had long since died out in Vulgar Latin were reintroduced, h and w, onfwcf, Picard w, e.g., vl altu greater than of halt, higher, l vesper greater than f geper, Picard weper, wallenwesser, all, wasp, l viscus greater than f gui, mistletoe, ul vulpiculu, fox kit, greater than of golpals, Picard whoople, fox. On the opposite, the Italian, Portuguese and Spanish words of Germanic origin borrowed from French or directly from Germanic retain, gw, tilde program, e.g., it, sp, guerra, war. In these examples, we notice a clear consequence of bilingualism, that sometimes even changed the first syllable of the Latin words. One example of a Latin word influencing an Old Low Franconian loan is framboise, raspberry, from of frambaza, from olf asterisk brambisi, blackberry, blended with olfraga or of fry, strawberry, which explains the replacement b greater than f, and in turn the final shay of framboise added to a fry to make fryser, modern phrase. Pope estimated that perhaps still 15% of the vocabulary of modern French derives from Germanic sources. Earliest written Old French at the Third Council of Tours in 813, priests were ordered to preach in the vernacular language, since the common people could no longer understand formal Latin. The earliest documents said to be written in French after the Reich are now in Castle glosses are the Oaths of Strasbourg. Pro Dio ama e pro Christian Pablo e nostro commune salvament, dis die en avant, in quant Deus savere pedime educanate. Si salverai io sistemion fradricalo, e in iadere in caduna cosa. The second oldest document in Old French is the Eulalia sequence, which is important for linguistic reconstruction of Old French pronunciation due to its consistent spelling. The royal house of Capet, founded by Hugh Capet in 987, inaugurated the development of northern French culture in and around Ile-de-France, which slowly but firmly asserted its ascendancy over the more southerly areas of Aquitaine and Tolosa. The Capetians langue d'oil, the forerunner of modern Standard French, did not begin to become the common speech of all of France, however, until after the French Revolution. Transmission to Middle French. In the late Middle Ages, the Old French dialects diverged into a number of distinct langues d'oil, among which Middle French proper was the dialect of the Île-de-France region. During the early modern period, French now becomes established as the official language of the Kingdom of France throughout the realm, also including the langue d'oc speaking territories in the south. It was only in the 17th to 18th centuries, with the development especially of popular literature read by a wide audience known by the term Bibliothèque Bleue, that a standardized classical French spread throughout France alongside the regional dialects. Literature. The material and cultural conditions in France and associated territories around the year 1100 triggered what Charles Homer Haskins termed the Renaissance of the 12th century, resulting in a profusion of creative works in a variety of genres. Old French gives way to Middle French in the mid-14th century, paving the way for early French Renaissance literature of the 15th century. The earliest extant French literary texts date from the 9th century, but very few texts before the 11th century have survived. The first literary works written in Old French were saints' lives. The Canticle of Saint Eulalie, written in the second half of the 9th century, is generally accepted as the first such text. At the beginning of the 13th century, Jean Bodel, in his Chanson de Cisneus, divided medieval French narrative literature into three subject areas: the matter of France or matter of Charlemagne, the matter of Rome, romances in an ancient setting, and the matter of Britain, Arthurian romances, and Breton lay. The first of these is the subject area of the chansons de gestades, epic poems typically composed in 10-syllable assonant laces. More than 100 chansons de gesta have survived in around 300 manuscripts. The oldest and most celebrated of the chansons de gesta is the Song of Roland. Bertrand de Bar-sur-Aube in his Gerard de Vienne set out a grouping of the chansons de gesta into three cycles: the Gesta du Roi centering on Charlemagne, the Gesta de Guerin de Montglain, whose central character was William of Orange, and the Gesta de Dun de Mainz, or the rebel vassal cycle, the most famous characters of which were Renaud de Montauban and Gerard de Roussillon. A fourth grouping, not listed by Bertrand, is the Crusade Cycle, dealing with the First Crusade and its immediate aftermath. Jean Bodel's other two categories, the Matter of Rome and the Matter of Britain, concern the French Romance or Roman. Around 100 verse romances survive from the period 1150 to 1220. From around 1200 on, the tendency was increasingly to write the romances in prose, although new verse romances continued to be written to the end of the 14th century. The most important romance of the 13th century is the Romance of the Rose, which breaks considerably from the conventions of the chivalric adventure story. Medieval French lyric poetry was indebted to the poetic and cultural traditions in southern France and Provence, including Toulouse, Poitiers, and the Aquitaine region, where langue d'oc was spoken. In their turn, the Provençal poets were greatly influenced by poetic traditions from the Hispano-Arab world. The Occitan or Provençal poets were called troubadours, from the word troubar, to find, to invent. Lyric poets in Old French are called trouvères. By the late 13th century, the poetic tradition in France had begun to develop in ways that differed significantly from the troubadour poets, both in content and in the use of certain fixed forms. The new poetic tendencies are apparent in the Roman de Fourville in 1310 and 1314, a satire on abuses in the medieval church filled with medieval motets, lay, rondeaux, and other new secular forms of poetry and music. The best-known poet and composer of Ars Nova secular music and chansons of the incipient Middle French period was Guillaume de Machaut. Discussions about the origins of non-religious theatre, both drama and farce, in the Middle Ages remain controversial, but the idea of a continuous popular tradition stemming from Latin comedy and tragedy to the 9th century seems unlikely. Most historians place the origin of medieval drama in the Church's liturgical dialogues and tropes. Mystery plays were eventually transferred from the monastery church to the chapter house or refectory hall and finally to the open air, and the vernacular was substituted for Latin. In the 12th century one finds the earliest extant passages in French appearing as refrains inserted into liturgical dramas in Latin, such as a St. Nicholas play and a St. Stephen play. An early French dramatic play is Le Jeu d'Adam, written in octosyllabic rhymed couplets with Latin stage directions. A large body of fables survive in Old French. These include literature dealing with the recurring trickster character of Rainward the Fox. Marie de France was also active in this genre, producing the Aesopus series of fables in verse. Related to the fable was the more bawdy Fableaux, which covered topics such as cuckolding and corrupt clergy. These Fableaux would be an important source for Chaucer and for the Renaissance short story. Phonology. Old French was constantly changing and evolving. However, the form in the late 12th century, as attested in a great deal of mostly poetic writings, can be considered standard. The writing system at this time was more phonetic than that used in most subsequent centuries. In particular, all written consonants were pronounced, except for S preceding non-stop consonants and T and A, and final E was pronounced E. The phonological system can be summarized as follows. Consonants notes. The affricates ts, dz, t, d became fricatives in Middle French. Ts was written as c, c, z, as in cent, chanson, prize. DZ was written as Z, as in dose, 12, as in conseil. Travailler became J in modern French. N appeared not only in the middle of a word, but also at the end, as in point, hand. At the end of a word, N was later lost, leaving a nasalized vowel. H was found only in Germanic loanwords and was later lost. In native Latin words, H was lost early on, as in uem, from Latin homo. Intervocalic D, from both Latin T and D, was lenited to th in the early period. At the end of words it was also devoiced to theta. In some texts it was sometimes written as dh or th. By 1100 it disappeared altogether. Vowels in Old French. The nasal vowels were not separate phonemes, but occurred as allophones of the oral vowels before a nasal consonant. This nasal consonant was fully pronounced, thus bon was pronounced bon. Nasal vowels were present even in open syllables before nasals, where modern French has oral vowels, as in bone, bone. Monophthongs notes. O had formerly existed, but closed to U. It would later appear again when, or, monophthongized, and also when, closed in certain positions. Diphthongs and triphthongs notes. In earlier Old French, the spelling I represented a diphthong, aj, instead of the later monophthong, and a represented the diphthong, ej, which became oj, in late Old French. In early Old French the diphthongs described above as rising may have been falling diphthongs. In earlier works with vowel assonance, the diphthong written I did not assonate with any pure vowels, suggesting that it cannot have simply been j. The pronunciation of the vowels written u in u is debated. In very early Old French, they represented uo, ow, and by Middle French, they had both merged as o tilde o, but it is unclear what the transitional pronunciations were.